The letter was already written before she ever stepped off the train. Caleb Thornton had made up his mind 3 weeks earlier, the moment his neighbor's wife let slip that the woman traveling west to marry him had a cough. A persistent one, she'd said, pressing her lips together in that way people do when they mean something far worse than what they're saying. And so he wrote the letter, sealed it, handed it to the station manager, and went back to his ranch without losing a single hour of sleep. He never even looked at her face. He never read her letters again, the ones where she described the way she'd taught herself to read land surveys, or how she'd nursed her younger brother through a fever winter with nothing but vinegar, compresses, and stubbornness. He didn't think about any of that. He thought about his cattle, his fields, and the idea that a sick woman would only become one more burden on a frontier that already had too many. What he didn't know, what no one standing on that frozen platform in Millhaven Station, Wyoming, on the 23rd of November, 1884, could have predicted, was that the woman he'd just thrown away would become the one person that entire territory would one day desperately need. But on that afternoon, she was just a woman alone in the snow, holding a letter that had ended her life as she knew it. Pa, if this story already has you feeling something, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and hit that bell so you never miss what comes next. And while you're at it, drop a like and leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. These stories travel further than any train ever could, and I want to see just how far this one goes. The train had been late by 4 hours, which meant Evelyn Hartwell arrived at Millhaven Station just as the last gray light was being swallowed by the coming dark. She had been awake for 31 hours. She knew the exact number because she'd counted them somewhere around hour 22, sitting rigid in her seat as the train labored through a pass in the mountains, the car cold enough that she could see her breath, counting hours, the way people count things when they're too frightened to sleep and too exhausted to think clearly. 31 hours since she'd left the boarding house in Philadelphia with her one good traveling case and her winter coat. The brown one, not the blue, because the brown was heavier, and her mother had always said brown was more practical for long distances. Her mother had also said that taking a train to Wyoming to marry a man she'd never met was the most reckless thing she'd ever heard of. She'd said it 6 different ways across 4 separate arguments, and then she'd hugged Evelyn at the door and told her she loved her and pressed $2 extra into her coat pocket without saying a word about it. That was the thing about her mother. She could fight you and love you in the same breath. Evelyn thought about that hug as she gathered her case from the overhead rack, her arms aching from the weight of it, her chest already tightening from the cold air that had begun seeping through the gaps around the windows an hour outside of Millhaven. She breathed slowly, deliberately, the way she'd taught herself. In through the nose, a count of 4, out through the mouth. It helped sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. She stepped onto the platform and the wind hit her like a flat hand. Wyoming winter didn't introduce itself. It simply arrived, all at once, in your face and down your collar and through the soles of your boots before you'd even finished looking around. She blinked against the driven snow. Small, hard flakes, more like ice crystals than anything soft. And looked up and down the platform for a man she'd only ever seen in a small photograph, slightly out of focus. A man with a square jaw and steady eyes who had signed his letters, "Yours in good faith, Caleb Thornton." The platform was nearly empty. A family huddled near the station door. A man with 2 young children, all 3 looking nearly frozen, waiting for someone who apparently hadn't come yet either. An older man in a station master's coat was moving along the platform checking something on a clipboard, not looking up. A young porter was hauling mail sacks off the rear car, his shoulders hunched against the wind. No Caleb. She told herself he was simply late. The storm, probably. The roads into town from the ranches could get treacherous in snow like this. She'd read about it, had asked about it in one of her letters, and Caleb had written back describing how a February ice storm 3 years earlier had made the main road into Millhaven completely impassable for 9 days. So he was delayed. That was all. She would wait inside where it was warmer, and he would arrive, and he would apologize for the delay, and she would say it was perfectly all right, and that would be the beginning of things. She was still telling herself this when the station master appeared at her elbow. He was a heavy-set man with a red nose and small eyes that didn't quite meet hers, and he was holding an envelope, white, sealed, her name written across the front in handwriting she recognized from months of correspondence. "Miss Evelyn Hartwell." "You're the Hartwell woman?" he said. Not unkindly exactly, but not warmly either. The way a man says something when he already knows how it ends. I am. She set down her case. Mr. Thornton asked me to give you this. He held out the envelope. He came by yesterday. Said to give it to you when you got off the train. Yesterday. He'd come the day before she arrived, left a letter, and left. She took the envelope. Her fingers were already numb enough from the cold that she could barely feel the paper, and she was aware of the station master still standing there, not quite watching her, but not quite looking away either, and of the porter who had stopped moving mail sacks and was now doing a very poor job of pretending not to look. She broke the seal and unfolded the page. Caleb Thornton's handwriting was neat. She'd always noticed that about his letters, a careful, almost rigid neatness, like a man who'd been made to practice penmanship as a boy and never forgot the discipline of it. Miss Hartwell, I have given this considerable thought and concluded that pursuing our arrangement would be a mistake. Word has reached me regarding the state of your health. I run a cattle operation of 300 head across 800 acres of difficult terrain. The work required to maintain it, and to maintain a household on this land, is not suited to a woman in a delicate condition. I do not write this with malice, but with practicality. The frontier is not forgiving, and I cannot afford to take on a burden that would strain my resources and potentially compromise the welfare of my operation. I have left money with the station master to cover your return passage to the east. I wish you well. Caleb Thornton. She read it twice, not because she hadn't understood it the first time. She understood it immediately, all of it, the words and the logic behind them, and the particular flavor of dismissal that dressed itself up as practicality, while never once acknowledging that there was a human being on the other end of the arrangement. She read it twice because the first time she was still somewhere inside the hope of the last 31 hours, and it took the second reading to close the door on that completely. A burden that would strain my resources. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it in her coat pocket. Miss? The station master's voice had shifted slightly, still not warm but cautious now, in the way people get when they're not sure if a woman is about to cry or about to do something else entirely. The money he left, it should be enough for your ticket back. I can help you arrange. Thank you, she said. I'll let you know. She picked up her case and walked to the far end of the platform, away from the station master and the porter and the family by the door, and she stood at the edge of the platform where the boards gave way to frozen ground and looked out at the dark coming across the flat land beyond the station. The cough came then, because of course it did. Cold air, stress, exhaustion, it hit all the right triggers, and she pressed her free hand to her mouth and let it work through her, standing straight, not folding, not sitting down. When it passed, she breathed again. In, 4 counts, out. She was not going back. She had no entirely rational reason for this decision. The money for the return ticket was sitting with the station master. She had almost nothing left of her own funds after the westbound passage. She had no acquaintances in Millhaven, no contacts, no plan. The sensible, practical, intelligent thing to do was to take the money, sleep the night somewhere warm, and board the first eastbound train in the morning. But the sensible thing had a shape she recognized, and the shape of it was going home and listening to her mother be gentle and careful and loving in the way that she was when she was also trying not to say "I told you so," and going back to the boarding house and the seamstress work and the small, measured life she'd spent 2 years trying to find a way out of. She had not traveled 1,000 miles to turn around in the snow. She was still standing there, working out what exactly she was going to do next, when the sound of hooves came in from the western approach to the station. Not the quick clatter of a horse in a hurry, but the steady, deliberate rhythm of an animal being ridden with patience in difficult weather. She didn't turn around right away. She heard the rider slow, heard the horse blow out a long breath, heard boots hit the ground and the sound of someone tying off a rein. Then a voice, low, not directed at her, probably directed at the station master. Any trouble with the storm on the North Road? Some drifting past the Hendricks place, the station master said. Nothing blocked yet. Good. A pause. Train came in all right? 4 hours late, but she made it. Another pause. Longer. Evelyn turned around. The man standing near the station door was not particularly tall, average height, maybe an inch above it, and he was the kind of lean that came from years of actual physical work rather than from not eating enough. His coat was heavy canvas, the collar turned up against the wind. He had a hat pulled low and several days of dark beard, and the kind of face that looked like it had spent most of its life outdoors without much concern for what weather did to it. He was looking at her, not in the way the station master had looked at her, assessing and slightly pitying, not the way the other passengers on the train had sometimes glanced at her when the cough was bad, that particular mixture of sympathy and desire to be somewhere else. He was looking at her the way you look at something that doesn't quite fit with what you expected to find, and you're still working out why. She looked back at him with the flattest expression she could manage, because she was tired and cold, and she had just been informed in politely arranged sentences that she was a burden to a man who'd never even met her, and she was not particularly interested in whatever a stranger was about to say. He said, "You get what you came for?" It was such an odd question that for a moment she just stared at him. "I beg your pardon?" "You're the woman who came on the train." It wasn't quite a question. "And you're standing out here alone in the cold instead of inside, so I'm guessing what you came for didn't go the way you planned." "That," she said, "is a remarkable amount of conclusion to draw from a woman standing on a platform." "Maybe." He didn't seem particularly bothered by the observation. "But I passed Thornton's foreman on the road in. He mentioned the situation." The situation. She absorbed this. Of course. Of course, Caleb Thornton's foreman was already discussing the situation with passing strangers on the road before she'd even read the letter. "Then you're already better informed than I am," she said, "since I've only just found out about the situation myself." I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a sorry way to do things." "Yes," she agreed, "it is." The wind came up hard between them, driving snow sideways across the platform, and her cough started again before she could stop it. Not the worst kind, but persistent enough and long enough that by the time it finished her eyes were watering, which she found deeply irritating because it probably looked like crying. It was not crying. When she straightened up, he was still there. He hadn't stepped back. Most people stepped back, she'd noticed, as though whatever she had might travel the distance between them and take root. He was standing in the same place he'd been, and his expression hadn't changed into that particular shade of discomfort she was used to seeing. "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" he said. "I'm working on that." He looked at her case, then back at her. "Millhaven's got one boarding house. Mrs. Plunkett's on the main street, 2 blocks north. She's reasonable and she keeps her rooms warm. Tell her Wyatt Mercer sent you and she'll give you a fair rate." Evelyn studied him for a moment. "And why would you do that?" "Do what?" "Offer assistance to a complete stranger." He seemed to think about this seriously, as though it were a genuine question rather than a politely suspicious one. "It's cold," he finally said, "and you look like you've been traveling a long time. And Thornton's foreman was laughing when he told me about it, which I didn't much care for." She hadn't expected that last part. It landed somewhere under her sternum and sat there. "He was laughing," she repeated. "Some men think it's funny," Wyatt Mercer said, with the flat and simple contempt of someone who had made his opinion on the matter very clear long before this conversation. She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up her case. "Mrs. Plunkett's," she said, 2 blocks north." "That's right." She walked past him toward the station door, and then stopped and turned back. "My name is Evelyn Hartwell." "I know," he said. "Mercer." "Yes," she said. "You mentioned." She went inside. Mrs. Eliza Plunkett was a tall, narrow woman of about 60, who wore her white hair in a severe bun and regarded Evelyn with eyes that assessed things very quickly and very accurately. She said the name Wyatt Mercer with a slight nod, as though it confirmed something she'd half expected, and she showed Evelyn to a room on the second floor that was small but had a wood stove already burning in the corner and a window that looked out over the main street of Millhaven. "Dinner's at 7, Mrs. Plunkett said at the door. "If you're hungry before then, there's bread and butter on the sideboard in the parlor." "Thank you. I want to be straightforward with you about my finances. Mr. Mercer's name's enough for tonight," Mrs. Plunkett said. "We'll sort out the rest in the morning when you've slept." And she pulled the door closed before Evelyn could argue. Evelyn stood in the middle of the small room for a long moment. The wood stove made a small, ticking sound as the heat moved through it. Outside, the wind pushed snow against the window in waves. She opened her traveling case on the narrow bed and took out what she always took out first, the bundle of letters, tied with kitchen string. 18 months of correspondence with Caleb Thornton. She didn't open them. She just held the bundle and looked at it. All that careful, hopeful effort, all those evenings at the small desk in her boarding house room in Philadelphia, choosing words with such deliberation, trying to be honest without frightening him, trying to be appealing without being dishonest. She set the letters on the windowsill. Then she took out her notebook, a plain brown composition book she'd been using for 3 years, half filled with everything: observations, lists, things she'd read and wanted to remember, calculations about the cost of things, questions she meant to look up. She opened it to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top, and then she wrote, "Arrived Millhaven. Thornton's letter, not going back." She underlined the last 3 words twice. She slept for 11 hours. When she woke, the storm was still going but lighter. The hard, sideways driving snow had settled into something more ordinary and vertical, and the town outside her window was beginning to show itself. A general store across the street, a smithy 2 buildings down from that, the outline of a church at the far end of the block. Maybe 200 people in this town, she estimated. Maybe fewer. She had $11.43. She sat with her notebook and made a list of what she knew how to do: read and write well. Arithmetic. Basic accounting. She'd kept books for a dry goods store in Philadelphia for 8 months before the owner's nephew came back from Ohio and needed the position. She could sew adequately, not beautifully. She could cook for small numbers of people. She knew a fair amount about treating common ailments because her father had been a physician's assistant before his lungs gave out, and he'd let her read everything on his shelves and sometimes sit with patients when the physician allowed it. She looked at the list. $11.43 and a list of skills, in a town of maybe 200 people in Wyoming territory in November. She went downstairs for breakfast. There were 3 other boarders at Mrs. Plunkett's table. A traveling salesman from Denver who was stuck because of the storm and had the defeated look of a man who was supposed to be somewhere else by now, and 2 brothers named Griggs who were freighters waiting on a delivery. None of them paid Evelyn much attention, which she appreciated. Mrs. Plunkett poured coffee without being asked and set a plate of eggs and salt pork and bread in front of her without discussion, and Evelyn ate everything on it because she hadn't eaten anything substantial since before Philadelphia, and her body was making its needs extremely clear. She was finishing the bread when Mrs. Plunkett sat down across from her with her own cup of coffee. "You plan to stay in Millhaven," Mrs. Plunkett said. Not a question. "I do." Mrs. Plunkett looked at her steadily. "You have work lined up?" "Not yet." "Money?" "Not much." Mrs. Plunkett drank her coffee. "Can you teach?" Evelyn looked up. "Teach what?" "Children. Reading, arithmetic, writing. The school teacher we had left in August married a man in Cheyenne and went south. We've got 23 children in this settlement who haven't had proper schooling in 3 months." She set down her cup. "The community pays a small salary, not enough to get rich on. Enough to live on if you're not wasteful." Evelyn stared at her. "You're offering me a teaching position." "I'm telling you it exists and that you appear to be qualified." Mrs. Plunkett's tone made clear this was a meaningful distinction. "Whether you want it is your business." "Yes," Evelyn said, "I want it." She spent the next 3 days navigating what it actually meant to establish herself in a town where she knew no one and where, it became clear within about 48 hours, her arrival and Caleb Thornton's letter were already common knowledge. The frontier had its own particular speed of gossip. By the end of her first full day, she had been identified to at least 6 different people as the Eastern woman Thornton turned away. She heard it used in the general store when she went in to buy basic supplies. Heard the woman behind the counter pause the conversation she was having with another customer just long enough to look at Evelyn with that specific expression that meant, "This is the one I was telling you about." It was the kind of thing that was supposed to make you shrink. She'd noticed that. The particular deployment of other people's knowledge of your humiliation, used as a kind of informal social pressure, was designed to make you fold, apologize for your existence, retreat. Evelyn had had enough things in her life try to make her fold. She bought her cornmeal and her lamp oil and her 2 yards of heavier flannel for a warmer blouse, paid exactly what was asked, thanked the woman behind the counter, and left. The school was a single room on the east side of town, a rectangle of rough-cut boards with a potbelly stove and 23 mismatched chairs and a chalkboard that needed replacing. The first morning she opened it, she arrived to find 8 children waiting outside in the cold. The others came in over the next half hour as word traveled, in the particular way it does in small communities, that the school teacher position had been filled by someone who was actually there. The children ranged from 5 to 14. 3 of the older ones read tolerably well. 2 could barely write their own names. The rest fell at various places along that spectrum. Evelyn looked at them all assembled in their mismatched chairs and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, because happiness required a steadier footing than she currently had, but something adjacent to it, something purposeful. "My name is Miss Hartwell," she said. "I've come a very long way, and I expect you to make it worth my while. We'll begin with arithmetic." It was the end of her first week when she saw Wyatt Mercer again. She was crossing the main street in the late afternoon, heading back to Mrs. Plunkett's after school, when he came out of the hardware store across the way carrying a coil of rope and a bag of something heavy and loaded it onto a horse that was tied at the post out front. He didn't see her at first, and she might have walked past without stopping. She wasn't sure what she would have said, but then he turned, and there was a moment of mutual acknowledgement that made it awkward to pretend otherwise. She crossed to him. "Mr. Mercer." "Miss Hartwell." He looked at her with what she was beginning to recognize as his particular expression of simply observing whatever was in front of him, without decoration. "You're still here. I told you I wasn't leaving." "You did." He tied off the bag. "I heard you took the school teacher position. News travels. In Millhaven, it travels before the thing happens." He looked at her for a moment. "How is it?" "Underpaid and exhausting," she said. "I like it very much." Something moved at the corner of his mouth that might have been the beginning of a smile. "You need anything? For the school?" The question surprised her. "Why?" He shrugged, not dismissively, but in the way of a man who didn't feel a reason needed elaborate construction. "I know some people. There's lumber at the Hendricks mill that's been sitting. That chalkboard in there's been needing replacing since before the last teacher left." She studied him. "You make a habit of this? Finding strangers in train stations and pointing them toward solutions?" "Not particularly," he said. "You were a specific case." "What kind of specific case?" He looked at her for a moment before answering. "The kind where someone's got a problem that's fixable, and they're fixing it," he said. "That's worth paying attention to." She didn't quite know what to do with that. It was said plainly, without embellishment, and that made it somehow harder to deflect than if he'd been effusive. "I could use the lumber," she said finally, "and the chalkboard. I'll see what I can do." The trouble with Caleb Thornton started not 3 weeks into Evelyn's time in Millhaven, and it started precisely the way trouble like that usually starts, through a third party. His foreman, the same man who had apparently been laughing on the road when he told Wyatt about the situation, came into the school one afternoon while Evelyn was finishing up with the last of the children and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. His name was Asa Briggs, she'd since learned. A broad, flat-faced man who carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who derived personal status from his proximity to a powerful employer. "Mr. Thornton would like a word," he said. Evelyn erased the arithmetic problem from the chalkboard, the new one, which Wyatt Mercer had appeared with 3 days earlier along with 2 men from the mill and a wagon of lumber, without turning around. "Mr. Thornton is welcome to come speak to me himself. He's a busy man. As am I." She finished erasing. "When he has a moment, he knows where to find me." Briggs stood in the doorway for another moment, visibly uncertain how to proceed with a woman who was simply not cooperating with the social structure he expected to be operating within. Then he left. She watched him go through the window. Caleb Thornton arrived the following morning before school began. She had seen him in his photograph, but photographs in 1884 were stiff, formal things that showed you the shape of a person but almost nothing of their substance. In person, Caleb Thornton was a larger man than she'd imagined. Broad in the shoulders, mid-40s, with a well-trimmed beard going gray at the edges, and the kind of direct physical presence that probably commanded a great deal in rooms full of men. He came in and took off his hat, which was at least something. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Mr. Thornton." He looked around the schoolroom, at the new chalkboard, at the rows of chairs, at the order she'd established over the past weeks, with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between assessment and discomfort. "I wanted to—" He stopped, started again. "I've heard you've done well here." She waited. I may have acted too hastily, he said. She looked at him steadily. What specifically feels hasty to you now, Mr. Thornton? The decision or the method? He blinked. Because those are different things, she continued. A man is entitled to make whatever decision he believes is right for his circumstances. What he is somewhat less entitled to is delivering that decision through a sealed letter handed to a stranger at a train station after the woman in question has traveled 1,000 miles in good faith. She set down the chalk she'd been holding. So, which part feels hasty? Caleb Thornton was quiet for a moment. She could see him recalibrating, the way men do when they've walked into a conversation expecting one kind of terrain and found another. Both, he said finally. All right, she said. That's at least honest. I'd like to... He stopped again. I think I made a judgment that wasn't fair. No, she agreed. It wasn't. He looked at her with the slightly baffled expression of a man who had come prepared to apologize and was finding the experience more complicated than anticipated. I didn't know anything about you, really. No, you didn't. She picked up her chalk again. My children arrive in 20 minutes, Mr. Thornton. Was there something specific you wanted to say? He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, Would you be willing to have dinner? To talk? Evelyn considered this. She looked at Caleb Thornton, at the wide, strong, somewhat uncertain man who had made a clinical decision about her life and then driven into town 3 weeks later to revisit it. And she thought carefully about what she wanted to say. I'll think about it, she said. It was not a yes. She could see he knew it wasn't a yes. He put his hat back on and nodded and left. She turned back to the chalkboard. She told Mrs. Plunkett that evening, mostly because she needed to tell someone, and Mrs. Plunkett had proven herself to be a woman who gave information more often than opinions. He came to see you, Mrs. Plunkett said, without much visible surprise. He did. He's had other arrangements fall through, Mrs. Plunkett said, in the tone of someone relaying weather information. He's not a cruel man, Thornton. He's a practical one. Sometimes those are worse. What do you mean? Mrs. Plunkett looked at her with the measured directness that Evelyn had come to associate with her at her most informative. A cruel man does what he does because he wants to hurt someone. A practical man does it because he's decided, in his own accounting, that it makes sense. He can always tell himself it was reasonable. There's no guilt in reasonable. She poured more coffee. That's what makes it hard to forgive. Evelyn thought about that for a long time after she went upstairs. She took out the bundle of letters from her traveling case and sat with them on the edge of her bed, not opening them, just holding them. 18 months of carefully chosen words. 18 months of trying to show someone her mind and her character and the particular shape of who she was, through the limited medium of paper and ink and a postal system that took 2 weeks each direction. She'd believed, reading his letters, that he was a man of intelligence and seriousness. She still believed that. The problem was that intelligence and seriousness were not the same thing as fairness or courage or the particular capacity to see past your own fear into another person's actual worth. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Another storm coming. She put the letters back in the case. In through the nose. 4 counts. Out. She wasn't done with Millhaven yet, not by a very long way. The dinner invitation sat unanswered for 4 days. Evelyn hadn't made a decision so much as she'd made a deliberate choice not to make one yet, which was its own kind of decision, and she knew it. She had other things to think about. 23 children who needed teaching, a chalkboard that still needed a corner bracket tightened, and a persistent draft coming through the north wall of the schoolroom that she'd been stuffing with rags every morning, only to find them shifted again by afternoon. She thought about Caleb Thornton in the margins of these things. Not obsessively. More the way you think about a splinter you haven't decided whether to dig out yet, aware of it, occasionally pressing at it, not ready to commit to the discomfort of actually dealing with it. What Mrs. Plunkett had said stayed with her. A practical man can always tell himself it was reasonable. The thing was, Evelyn understood practical people. She'd been raised by one. Her father had been the most practically minded man she'd ever known. Gentle in his way, not unkind, but possessed of a deep and consistent certainty that the world was organized according to a logic that could be understood and accounted for, and that feelings were simply data points to be weighed alongside all the other data points. He had decided when Evelyn was 12 that her chronic chest problems would prevent her from having a normal life, and he had adjusted his expectations of her accordingly, and had done so with such calm and reasonable clarity that she hadn't recognized until she was much older what it had cost her to be looked at that way by the person who was supposed to believe in her most. So yes, she understood practical people. She wasn't sure that understanding made her more inclined to have dinner with one. On the 5th day, she was walking back from the schoolhouse in the early dark. The days were short now, the sun down before 5, and she'd stayed late helping the older Granger boy with his reading when she nearly walked directly into Wyatt Mercer coming around the corner of the hardware store. "Sorry," he said, stepping back. He was carrying something, a length of iron pipe and what looked like a collection of brackets. She looked at the brackets. "Are those for the schoolroom wall?" "Corners pulling away from the foundation on the north side," he said. "I noticed it last week. These'll hold it through the winter at least." She stared at him. "I didn't ask you to do that." "No," he agreed. "Mr. Mercer, I'm not in a position to pay you for—" "I didn't ask for pay." "That's not the point." She heard her own voice come out sharper than she'd intended and made a small effort to adjust. "The point is, I don't know why you keep doing things." He seemed to consider this seriously, in that unhurried way he had. "The wall is pulling away from the foundation," he said again. "That's the reason. That's the practical reason. Most reasons are practical reasons. Not all of them." He was quiet for a moment, and the wind moved between them, and somewhere down the street a door banged. Then he said, "You want to walk? It's cold standing still." It was an odd segue. She went with it. "Where?" "Nowhere in particular, just not standing in one place." They walked. The main street of Millhaven at 6 in the evening in December was not especially busy. A few people moving between the saloon and the general store. Lamplight from the windows of houses set back from the road. The distant sound of a dog that couldn't decide whether it was cold enough to stop barking. "Thornton came to see you," Wyatt said. Also not a question. "News travels," she said for the second time since arriving in Millhaven, and it occurred to her that this was becoming a kind of refrain. "Did you talk to him?" "Briefly." She watched her breath in the cold air. "He wants to have dinner." Wyatt said nothing. "You don't have an opinion about that?" she said. "I have opinions about most things," he said. "Doesn't mean they're yours to deal with." She looked at him sideways. Most men she'd encountered in her life, most people really, could not resist filling a silence that contained a potential opening for their view. Wyatt Mercer seemed genuinely unbothered by the presence of a question he didn't feel entitled to answer. She found this both slightly unnerving and oddly restful. "Tell me something about him," she said. "Something true." Wyatt walked a few steps before answering. "He built his operation himself. Came out here 15 years ago with not much and built it into something real. That's not nothing." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "He's a man who makes decisions based on what he can see in front of him. Has a hard time accounting for what he can't see yet." He glanced at her. "That's also true." Evelyn thought about this. "And you? How do you make decisions?" "Slower," he said. "I've been wrong enough times that I don't rush it anymore." She almost laughed. Not from humor exactly, but from the unexpectedness of it, the plain, unglamorous self-assessment. "What have you been wrong about?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. They'd turned at the end of the main street and were coming back now, the lights of Mrs. Plunkett's visible ahead. "I had a partner," he said finally, "running cattle together, about 6 years back. Man named Dorset. I thought I knew his character. Turned out I'd seen what I wanted to see instead of what was there." He said it the way you say something you've already finished being angry about and arrived at the other side of. "Lost 2 years' worth of work to that mistake. And a friendship, which was the worst part." She looked at him. "I don't talk about it much," he said, not defensively, just factually. "Why did you tell me?" He seemed to think about that with genuine attention. "Because you asked something real," he said. "Seemed worth a real answer." They had arrived at Mrs. Plunkett's. She stopped at the front steps. "The wall bracket," she said. "Can you come by Saturday morning before the children arrive?" "I can do that." "Thank you," she said. And then, because it felt important to say, "For the chalkboard too, and the lumber." He nodded once, and there wasn't anything sentimental in it, just acknowledgement. He turned and walked back down the street, and she stood on the front steps for a moment watching him go, and then she went inside. She wrote a note to Caleb Thornton that evening. "Mr. Thornton, I'll meet you for dinner Thursday at the hotel dining room. I want to be clear that this is a conversation, not a resumption of our arrangement. Evelyn Hartwell. She had Mrs. Plunkett's boy deliver it in the morning. Bye. The hotel dining room in Millhaven was the most formally appointed space in town, which was not saying an enormous amount. Starched tablecloths, 2 oil lamps per table, a menu written on a chalkboard that offered 3 options on any given evening, none of which was guaranteed to be available. But it had the quality of seriousness that a dinner conversation required, and Evelyn arrived on Thursday at precisely 6 o'clock in her best dress, which was a deep green wool that had seen better days but was still presentable, and sat down to wait. Caleb Thornton arrived 4 minutes late. He had made an effort, clean shave, good coat, hat left at the door, and he sat down across from her with the particular careful energy of a man who has rehearsed an opening and is now deciding whether to use it. He used it. "I want to apologize properly," he said. "Not the way I did at the school. Properly." She waited. "What I did was wrong," he said. "Not just the letter, the whole thing. The way I made a decision about a person I'd never even spoken to, based on a rumor from a neighbor's wife." He was looking at her steadily, which she gave him credit for. "You deserve better than that, and I'm sorry." She let the apology sit for a moment without rushing to accept or deflect it. "Was the neighbor's wife lying?" she said. "About my health?" He blinked slightly. "No, I don't think so." "She wasn't," Evelyn said. "I have a chronic chest condition. I've had it since I was 16. On bad days, it's significant. On good days, most people wouldn't know it was there. It is not going to kill me in the near term, and it is not going to improve dramatically either. It is simply a fact about me, the same way your bad knee." She'd heard about this from Mrs. Plunkett, who knew everything, "is a fact about you." Caleb was very still. "I never hid it from you," she continued. "I mentioned in my second letter that I had a chest condition. You wrote back and said it was no matter, that a frontier life had cured many an Eastern ailment." She kept her voice even. "I'm not saying that to wound you. I'm saying it because you should know that you had the information and chose for a while to weigh it differently than you did later." He was quiet for a long moment. "You're right," he said. "I did." The waiter brought them coffee, and they both wrapped their hands around the cups, and there was a minute where neither of them said anything, which was oddly easier than Evelyn had expected. "What changed?" she said finally. "Why did you come to the school?" Caleb turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "Briggs told me how things had gone at the station, with the letter." He paused. He found it amusing, the situation. "Yes," she said. "Mr. Mercer told me that." Something moved across Caleb's face at the mention of Wyatt's name. She couldn't quite read it. "Mercer said something to him about it," Caleb said. "On the road, apparently fairly directly." She filed this away. "And that made you reconsider?" "That and—" He stopped. He was working through something. She could see it, some internal negotiation between what he actually thought and what he was comfortable saying. "I saw you in town," he said finally. "The second week. You were coming out of the schoolhouse with 3 of the Garner children, helping the little one with his coat. You didn't know I was there." He paused again. "You didn't look like what I'd been told to expect." "And what had you been told to expect?" "Someone frail, struggling." "I was struggling," she said. "I just wasn't stopping." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "You weren't stopping." The food arrived, roast beef and boiled potatoes, the hotel's reliable fallback, and they ate and talked, and the conversation moved with the kind of careful, probing quality of 2 people who had significant information about each other but had arrived at it through paper and rumor rather than actual experience. He asked about her life in Philadelphia. She asked about the ranch, the land, the practical reality of running 800 acres in Wyoming winter. He was detailed and knowledgeable, talking about his operation, more relaxed than he'd been at the beginning of the evening, and she could see what must have drawn her to his letters: the intelligence, the precision of his observations, the way he described problems and solutions. But she also noticed, as the evening went on, when he spoke about people, his ranch hands, his neighbors, people in town, there was a consistent quality to it. He spoke about them in terms of usefulness, reliability, what they could and couldn't do. Even his compliments were functional. The blacksmith was reliable. The miller was efficient. Mrs. Plunkett was capable. She thought about what Mrs. Plunkett had said. A practical man. Sometimes those are worse. When he walked her back to the boarding house and asked at the door whether she might consider dinner again sometime, she said she needed to think about it. She could see he'd hoped for more than that. She said goodnight and went inside. December settled into Millhaven like a man who intended to stay. The temperature dropped in the second week to the kind of cold that made the air itself feel crystalline. Not unpleasant, exactly, when you were dressed for it, but absolutely unforgiving if you weren't. Evelyn learned quickly what everyone in frontier settlements learned. The cold was not your enemy so long as you respected it completely, and became your enemy the instant you didn't. She had dinner with Caleb Thornton 2 more times. The conversations were good. She would not pretend they weren't. He was attentive, asked thoughtful questions, and had genuinely reconsidered the assumptions he'd brought to the letter. She could see that. What she could also see, and couldn't quite unhear once she'd heard it, was the consistent thread of his thinking, that her survival in Millhaven had changed his assessment of her. That what had revised his opinion was not some deeper understanding of who she was, but evidence that she was capable of being useful in a frontier context. She had not changed. The information about her character had been available to him from the beginning, in every letter. What had changed was that she had proved something externally visible, something he could measure, and that had moved the needle. She kept thinking about what that meant. She was thinking about it on the afternoon of the 16th of December when Wyatt Mercer appeared at the schoolhouse door just as she was dismissing the children for the day. He wasn't alone. He had a girl with him, 11 or 12, dark hair, a serious face, hanging back slightly at his shoulder. Evelyn recognized her vaguely from around town but didn't know her name. "Miss Hartwell," Wyatt said. "This is Clara Reeves. Her family's on the Reeves claim, about 4 miles east." "Hello, Clara," Evelyn said. The girl said hello very quietly, looking at the floor. "She hasn't been coming to school," Wyatt said. "I thought she might want to." Evelyn looked at Clara, who was clearly deeply uncomfortable with this entire interaction. She looked at Wyatt, who returned her look with his typical lack of self-consciousness about the slightly unusual thing he had just done. "Clara," Evelyn said, "are you interested in school?" The girl looked up. She had sharp, watchful eyes. "My pa says it's not practical for girls." "What do you think?" A pause. Then very quietly, "I want to learn to read better." "Then you come Monday," Evelyn said. 7:30. Bring paper if you have it. If you don't, I have extra." Clara looked at Wyatt as though checking whether this was real. He gave the smallest nod. The girl looked back at Evelyn and said she'd be there, and then she went out to where a horse was tied and mounted it with practiced ease and rode off east without looking back. Evelyn looked at Wyatt. "Her father didn't send her." "No." "Does he know she's here?" "He will," Wyatt said, in a tone that managed to convey without elaboration that this was something he intended to handle. "Will he cause trouble?" "Probably some," he shrugged. "Clara's smart. She deserves a chance to get smarter." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. "You do this a lot," she said. "Find problems that aren't technically yours and fix them?" "I don't think of it as fixing," he said. "More like," he considered, "moving something that's in the wrong place to where it ought to be." She thought that this was one of the more quietly precise things she'd heard anyone say in a long time. "Come in," she said. "I was going to bank the stove for the evening. You can help." He came in, and they banked the stove, and she made a small fire in the small stove she kept at her end of the room, and they sat, not comfortably exactly, on the children's chairs that were slightly too small for adults, which gave the conversation a mildly absurd quality that she found she didn't mind at all. "You've been having dinner with Thornton," he said. Not accusatory. Informational. "I have." "And?" She looked at the stove. "He's trying," she said. "I think he genuinely is. I think he's a better man than the letter suggests." She paused. "I also think he looked at me for 18 months and saw a collection of attributes, and when one of them went below his minimum threshold, he discarded the whole." Wyatt was quiet. "And the hardest part," she said, "is that I understand it. I know what his life requires out here. I know the logic." She pressed her hands together. "Understanding it doesn't make it feel different." "No," he said, "it doesn't." You know that from experience? He looked at her. Different situation, but yes. She thought about the partner he'd mentioned, Dorset, the 2 years of work, the friendship. Does it get better? She said. Knowing you were assessed and found lacking. He was quiet for a moment. You weren't found lacking, he said. You were found inconvenient. That's different. She looked at him. Lacking means something's wrong with you, he said. Inconvenient means something's wrong with how they're looking. She was silent for a moment that stretched longer than she intended, because she was trying to process the small, significant difference between those two things and what it meant that no one had ever put it to her that plainly. Mr. Mercer, she said. Wyatt, he said. It's been 2 months. Wyatt, she said. Why did you really come to the schoolhouse today? He looked at her with his straightforward, undecorated attention. To bring Clara Reeves. And? He was quiet for a moment. Then, to see how you were doing after the dinners with Thornton. And how am I doing? Like someone who's working something out, he said, and getting close to the end of working it out. She looked at the fire. Outside, the wind had started up again. Wyoming's reliable background insistence on making everything slightly harder. The schoolroom had warmed with the 2 stoves going, and the light was the low amber kind that made things feel more settled than they were. I'm not going to marry Caleb Thornton, she said. She hadn't entirely known she'd made that decision until she heard herself say it. Wyatt didn't say anything. I think I knew before the second dinner, she said. I think I needed to go to find out what I already knew. She looked at her hands. The terrible thing is that I understand his logic. He built everything he has by himself, and he needs someone who can hold it with him. That's real. What's also real is that he looked at me and made a calculation, and I'm not sure I can be a partner to someone who's always calculating. She paused. Or maybe that's just what I'm telling myself because I'm still angry. Are you? Wyatt said. Still angry? She thought about it honestly. Less than I was, she said. More than I should be, probably. Probably right about where you should be, he said. She looked at him. You're surprisingly easy to talk to. People say that sometimes, he said, without particular pride in it, just acknowledgement. Does it ever feel like they're using you as a post to lean on? He considered this with the same serious attention he gave everything. Sometimes, he said. But I don't mind it if the person's actually working something through. I mind it when they just want to be told what they want to hear. He looked at her. You're not doing that. How do you know? Because half of what you're saying makes you uncomfortable, he said. People who want to be told what they want to hear don't say the uncomfortable parts. She was quiet. The dinners, she said finally. Did you think I was going to go back to him? A pause. Not a long one, but deliberate. I thought it was possible, Wyatt said. It would have made sense in a certain light, security, established situation. He looked at the fire. I thought it was possible. But? He glanced at her. But I thought you'd probably figure out what I figured out about him in about 5 minutes. Which is? That he's a good man who's also a man who needs everything to be something he can weigh and measure, Wyatt said. And you're not that. You're not something anyone's going to be able to weigh and measure for very long before you change on them. He said it without judgment, almost with a kind of quiet respect. Wouldn't suit him. Wouldn't suit you either. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Wyatt, she said. Yes. That's the most I've heard Jay in 2 months. He actually laughed at that. A short, real sound, not performed. Probably is, he said. She told Caleb Thornton the following Saturday. She'd asked him to come by the schoolhouse in the morning on the reasonable grounds that she didn't want to have the conversation in the hotel dining room where half the town would watch the shape of it from a distance and draw conclusions. He came. He sat in one of the adult chairs she'd put out. She wasn't cruel enough to offer him a child's chair. And he listened to what she said, which was that she was grateful for the apology, that she believed it was genuine, that she did not hold the letter against him in the permanent way she might have, but that she did not think they were suited to each other, and she was not going to pursue the arrangement. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. Is there someone else? He said. She had expected the question. That's not what this is about, she said. That's not an answer. No, she said. It's not. She looked at him directly. I don't believe that matters to what I've said. My answer would be the same either way. He sat with that. She could see him working through it, the practical man, adding up the columns. She felt something for him in that moment that surprised her with its generosity, a kind of clear-eyed sympathy for a person who was genuinely trying to understand something that didn't operate according to the rules he knew best. "I did underestimate you," he said finally. "Yes. I won't do it again." "I know you won't," she said. "I believe that. I just think it's too late for it to matter in the way you'd want it to." He nodded slowly and stood. He put on his hat and he looked at her one more time with an expression that was complicated and genuine, and then he said, "The town's lucky you stayed," and walked out. She sat in the empty schoolroom for a while after he left. Outside, she could hear the early morning sounds of Millhaven beginning its day. The blacksmith starting his forge, a cart on the main street, two women talking near the general store. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a life she had not expected to be building, but was, piece by piece, day by day, in this cold and unaccommodating and genuinely astonishing place. Clara Reeves arrived at 7:28, 2 minutes early, with a piece of brown paper folded into quarters that she explained apologetically was the closest thing to writing paper she'd been able to find. "It'll do perfectly," Evelyn said, and meant it. The other children came in around her, and the schoolroom filled with noise and cold air and the particular chaos of 23 people under the age of 15 trying to organize themselves. And Evelyn moved through it with the focused attention that she'd discovered, to her considerable surprise, was the one thing that had never once been affected by her condition, the sharpness of her mind when she was in the middle of something that mattered. She thought briefly of Wyatt Mercer. She thought about what he'd said. "You're not something anyone's going to be able to weigh and measure for very long before you change on them." She picked up the chalk. She had 23 children to teach, a north wall that was still slightly drafty despite the brackets, and a life that was coming together in ways she hadn't planned and couldn't have predicted, out here at the edge of everything, in a town in Wyoming that the wind had apparently decided to use as its personal project. She wrote the date on the chalkboard in large, clear letters. December 16th, 1884. "All right," she said, and the room settled, and she began. The trouble with Asa Briggs started the way. Most trouble in small frontier towns started, quietly, and then all at once. Clara Reeves had been coming to school for 9 days when her father showed up. Evelyn was at the chalkboard working through a long division problem with the older children when the door opened without a knock and let in a wall of cold air and a man she'd never spoken to but recognized by the shape of his silhouette and the quality of his expression. Jonas Reeves was a lean, weathered man in his late 40s, with the particular look of someone who had spent years fighting a land that didn't especially want him there and had begun to take it personally. He stood in the doorway and looked past Evelyn entirely, scanning the room until he found Clara in the third row. "Get your things," he said. The room went very quiet. 22 children turned to look at Clara. Clara sat without moving, her brown paper square still in her hand, her pen hovering over it. "Mr. Reeves," Evelyn said, putting herself between him and the room in a way that was not aggressive but was absolutely deliberate. "School doesn't finish until 3. He looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, which he essentially was. "I didn't ask what time school finishes." "Clara is doing very well," Evelyn said. "She has a particular gift for—" "Clara has chores," he said. "She has a younger brother who needs watching, and a mother who's down with a bad back, and she's been coming here behind my back for 9 days. He looked past Evelyn again. "Clara, now." Clara stood up slowly. She folded her brown paper square with careful, precise movements that Evelyn recognized as the movements of a person buying themselves time, and she put it inside the cover of the primer she'd been using, and she put the primer on the desk with a deliberateness that a man less fixed on his own authority might have noticed. Evelyn stepped slightly to the side so she wasn't physically blocking the aisle, because she was not going to create a situation where Jonas Reeves had to move her out of his way in front of his daughter. That would accomplish nothing except make him feel more justified. "Clara," she said as the girl reached the door, "your work will be here when you come back." Clara didn't look at her father. She looked at Evelyn for just a moment, that sharp, watchful look that missed nothing, and then she went out. Reeves looked at Evelyn with an expression that was not quite threatening and not quite anything else she had a clean word for. "I'd appreciate it," he said, "if you didn't encourage my children to disobey me." I'm not in the business of encouraging disobedience, Evelyn said. I'm in the business of teaching children to read and think. What they do with that is between them and their families. He didn't like that. She could see him not liking it. The slight tightening around the eyes, the jaw setting. He left without saying anything else, which was actually worse than if he'd said something, because it meant the conversation was not finished, just relocated. The room stayed quiet for a few seconds after the door closed. Then the Garner boy in the front row said, "Is Clara coming back?" in a voice that managed to be both very young and very perceptive about the actual odds. "I expect so," Evelyn said, and turned back to the chalkboard and resumed the long division problem. She was not certain she believed her own answer, but she said it because 22 children were looking at her to see how she carried it, and that was also part of what she was there for. She told Wyatt about it that evening. They had developed, without either of them formally proposing it, a loose habit of crossing paths in the late afternoon, sometimes at the schoolhouse when he was passing through town and stopped in, sometimes on the main street, once at Mrs. Plunkett's, where he'd come for supper because she let the occasional non-boarder in when there was enough food. The conversations were not planned and not exactly casual either. They had the quality of exchanges between two people who had found they could say real things to each other without elaborate preparation, and had decided, without discussing it, to keep doing that. He was at the hardware store when she found him, reviewing something with the proprietor over a hand-drawn diagram. He excused himself when he saw her expression. "Jonas Reeves came to the schoolhouse," she said. He absorbed this. "Took Clara out?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'll talk to him." "I don't want you to fix it," she said. He looked at her. "I mean that. If Clara comes back, I want it to be because something actually changed with her father, not because you've pressured him into something he resents." "That's not how I'd handle it." "How would you handle it?" He thought about it. "Jonas Reeves isn't a bad man," he said. "He's a man who's fighting a losing battle with his land, and he's scared, and scared men tighten their grip on what they think they control." He paused. "If I talk to him, I'm not going to talk about Clara. I'm going to talk about the North Field he's been losing to erosion for 3 seasons and why he hasn't fixed the drainage issue." She stared at him. "What does that have to do with Clara?" "Nothing directly. But if I can help him with the field, he'll have one less thing pressing on him. And when a man has one less thing pressing on him, sometimes he relaxes his grip on the other things." He looked at her. "It won't happen fast, but it'll happen better than if I show up and tell him his daughter deserves an education." Evelyn thought about this. It was an oblique approach, patient, indirect, and it was also, she thought, probably correct. "You're very good at this," she said. "At what?" "At understanding what's actually happening under the thing that looks like it's happening." He shrugged, in the way he did when a compliment made him uncomfortable without making him deny it. "People aren't usually as complicated as they think they are," he said. "They're mostly just scared of something." "And you?" she said. "What are you scared of?" He looked at her, a long, level look that she had come to recognize as him taking a question seriously rather than deflecting it. "Getting it wrong again," he said, "like with Dorset. Thinking I see something clearly, and finding out later I was looking at what I wanted to be there." "And do you think you see clearly now?" He held her gaze. "I think I'm trying to," he said, "more carefully than I used to." She nodded and looked away, because there was something in the directness of his answer that required a moment to absorb, and she was not quite ready to absorb all of it in the middle of the hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon. Christmas in Millhaven was a spare affair. The community gathered in the school, her school, which had become by default the largest public space in town that wasn't the saloon, and there was food that various families brought in, and someone played a fiddle, and the children performed a short recitation that Evelyn had spent 2 weeks organizing, with results that were endearing in their imperfection. Clara Reeves was not there. What was there, which Evelyn had not expected, was a level of warmth directed at her that she hadn't known was coming. Mrs. Plunkett brought her a knitted wool scarf in dark red and presented it with the brevity of a woman who considered extended sentiment a character flaw. The Garner family brought her a small jar of preserved peaches, which in Wyoming in December was a gift of genuine value. 3 mothers she'd barely spoken to pulled her aside at various points during the evening to tell her what a difference she'd made to their children in the particular way of women who chose their moments carefully and meant every word when they finally said them. She sat with all of this on the walk back to Mrs. Plunkett's that night, in the cold and the quiet. She had not wanted this life. She had wanted the life in the letters, the organized, planned life, the husband and the household, and the sense of arrival that came with both. She had not wanted to be improvising her way through a Wyoming winter on a school teacher's salary, sleeping in a boarding house, worrying about a child she could not compel to return. And yet, she was not sure she had ever, in the organized and planned life she'd led in Philadelphia, felt as specifically and concretely necessary as she had felt tonight. She thought about that for a long time. The new year came in with a storm that lasted 4 days. It was not the worst storm Millhaven had seen. People told her so, in the helpful way they had of providing historical context for your current discomfort. But it was serious enough to keep everyone largely indoors and to shut the school for 3 days and to test the north wall bracket that Wyatt had installed, which held perfectly. On the second day of the storm, someone knocked at Mrs. Plunkett's front door in the early evening, and it was Wyatt, with snow on his hat and shoulders and a split over his left eyebrow that had been stitched but was still angry-looking. Mrs. Plunkett let him in and went to get coffee without being asked, which told Evelyn something about the regularity with which Wyatt Mercer apparently appeared at this door. "What happened?" Evelyn said. "Fence section on the north pasture came down in the wind. 2 of my cattle got out onto Briggs's land before I found them." He sat down at the kitchen table with the slightly careful movement of someone whose ribs were also involved in something. "Briggs's land," she said. "Asa Briggs. Thornton's foreman." "The same. And the cut on your head." "Briggs has a position on trespassing cattle," Wyatt said, in a tone that conveyed without drama that the position had been expressed physically. "He hit you." "He tried. We came to an agreement on the cattle." He touched the stitched cut briefly, with the absent gesture of a man who considers injury a logistical inconvenience. "It's not the first disagreement Briggs and I have had." Evelyn looked at him. "Because of me," she said. "Because of what you said to him on the road. When I arrived." Wyatt met her eyes. "That was a separate matter." "Was it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Briggs is the kind of man who enjoys other people's bad situations," he said. "I've had issues with that long before you got here. But it got worse." "Some." She sat down across from him. Mrs. Plunkett set coffee in front of both of them and left the room with the tact of a woman who had seen enough of life to know when to absent herself. "You shouldn't be taking hits on my account," Evelyn said. "I told you, it's not—" "I know what you told me," she said. "I'm telling you I notice things." He looked at her, that direct, unhurried attention. "Briggs works for Thornton," she said. "Thornton is unhappy with how things ended. Briggs is—" she chose her word carefully— "an instrument of that unhappiness. And you've positioned yourself between that instrument and me, in ways both obvious and not obvious." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "I want you to know I'm aware of it." "I'm not doing it as a strategy," Wyatt said. "I know you're not," she said. "That's what makes it worth noticing." He looked at his coffee for a moment. "Briggs has been talking to people," he said. "Not just about the cattle. He's been telling stories around town, about you." She felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with her condition. "What kind of stories?" "That you came here looking for a husband and got turned away because you're too ill to be useful. That you're staying out of stubbornness. That you're—" He paused, as though tasting each word before deciding to say it. "Not a fit person to be teaching children." The kitchen was very quiet. She had known, in the abstract way you know things, when you're too busy to think about them clearly, that there was a version of her reputation in Millhaven that was being shaped by people who had reasons to shape it a certain way. She'd heard fragments, a pause in a conversation at the general store, a look exchanged between 2 women at the Christmas gathering that might have meant nothing and might have meant something. But hearing it stated plainly was different from the abstract knowledge of it. "On what grounds?" she said. "My health?" "Partly. Partly that you're here alone, without family." He looked at her steadily. "It's the kind of talk that doesn't usually get proven or disproven. It just sits and people make their decisions about it." "And how many people are making decisions about it?" "Fewer than Briggs would like," Wyatt said. "The families whose children you teach aren't listening to him. Mrs. Plunkett has made her position clear to anyone who raises it near her." A pause. But there are people on the edges of this community who don't know you yet, and Briggs is working on those people." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why is he working so hard at this?" Wyatt's jaw tightened slightly. "Because Thornton asked him to," he said, "or didn't tell him not to, which amounts to the same thing." She absorbed this. Caleb Thornton, who had apologized genuinely and had told her the town was lucky she'd stayed, and who was also apparently doing nothing to stop his foreman from working to undermine her. The practical man, she thought, calculating again. Unable to weigh and measure her from up close, so using a different instrument from a distance. "All right," she said. "All right what?" Wyatt said. "All right, I know," she said. "Thank you for telling me. What are you going to do about it?" She looked at him. "Keep teaching," she said. "Keep being here. Keep being exactly what people can see I am." She paused. "What else would I do?" He looked at her for a moment. Then something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but she was getting better at reading him, in the direction of something that looked like admiration, plain and unadorned. "Nothing else makes sense," he agreed. It was in January that Evelyn first began to understand the land. She hadn't expected to. She was an Eastern woman, raised in cities and indoor spaces, and the vast, flat, ferociously open landscape of Wyoming territory had seemed to her, when she first arrived, more like a force of nature than a place, something to endure rather than understand. But Wyatt had a piece of land 4 miles north of Millhaven where he ran his cattle, not the 800 acres of Thornton's operation, but a solid 240, well-watered from a creek that came down from the hills, with a small house that he'd built himself and a barn that was in better repair than most things she'd seen in the territory. She went out there for the first time in early January, on a Sunday, at his invitation, to see a problem he'd been describing for 3 weeks, a section of the creek bank that was actively eroding and threatening to shift the water away from his best pasture. She had not expected to have opinions about creek erosion. She was surprised to find that she did. "The bank is pulling away here," she said, crouching at the edge, looking at the cut face of the earth where the water had been working at it. "But the water's not taking it straight on. It's coming at an angle, see? It's because that rock upstream is deflecting the current." Wyatt was standing behind her, watching both the bank and her. "That's right," he said, in the tone of someone who already knew this but was interested in watching someone else figure it out. "If you moved the rock, or braced against it, something to redirect the current back to the center, the bank would stop losing ground. It might even rebuild over a season or two." "That's what I figured," he said. "I needed a second opinion on the rock." She stood up and looked at the rock in question, a large, flat-sided thing that had probably been there since before any person had thought to run cattle in this valley. "You needed a second opinion on whether to move a rock that's been in the same place for 100 years. "I needed someone who'd look at it fresh," he said. "I've been looking at it so long I see what I expect to see." She looked at the rock, then at him. "You do that deliberately," she said. "Bring in a different pair of eyes." "When I can." "Is that why you sit?" She stopped. "Why I what?" She looked at the creek bank. "Why you noticed me at the station, when everyone else had already decided what they were seeing." He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe partly," he said. "Mostly I don't find it useful to decide what I'm looking at before I've actually looked." She thought about all the people in her life who had decided what they were looking at. Her father, with his careful, gentle recalibration of expectations. The doctors who assessed her at intervals and described her in terms of what she couldn't do. Caleb Thornton, with his letter. Asa Briggs, with his stories. The wind came off the hills and across the pasture, and she turned her face into it, which she'd stopped doing automatically in Philadelphia and had started doing again out here, without quite noticing when the change had happened. "I want to learn more about this," she said. "The land. How it works." Wyatt looked at her. "I can teach you some of it." "I know you can." She looked back at the rock. "How do we move it?" They moved the rock over the course of 2 hours, using a combination of a long iron bar, 2 fence posts as fulcrums, and a rope attached to Wyatt's horse, and it was significantly harder than it had looked from the bank, and involved Evelyn up to her knees in freezing creek water at one point, and at the end of it the rock was repositioned and the current was already visibly different, and her boots were soaked through, and she was colder than she'd been since the first night at Millhaven Station. She also felt genuinely, completely alive. Not in spite of the cold and the discomfort, because of them, or at least alongside them. That particular quality of aliveness that came from having done something real, something physical and specific in the world, something that had a before and an after. Wyatt built a fire on the bank while she wrung out her stockings, and they sat beside it until she was warm enough to be reasonably sure her feet were still there. And then they rode back to his house, and he made coffee, and they sat at his kitchen table. His house was plain and specific. Everything in it had a function. The bookshelf on the east wall was the only thing that surprised her. Not a small bookshelf, and not the books she'd expected, which would have been farm manuals and almanacs. Those were there, but alongside them were history, geography, something that looked like a surveying text, and 2 novels she recognized. She went to look at the novels without asking permission, because the bookshelf was right there, and she couldn't help it. "You read Melville," she said. "Twice," he said from the stove. "Why twice?" "First time I didn't understand half of it," he said. "Second time I wanted to see if I'd gotten smarter." "And had you?" "Some," he said. "Still don't understand all of it, but more of it makes sense." She ran her finger along the spines. She pulled out the surveying text, which was well used, the spine cracked, and pages marked. "You survey your own land?" "Briggs contested my east boundary 3 years ago," he said. "Said my fence was 6 feet over Thornton's property line. I figured if I was going to argue the survey, I needed to understand the survey." He brought the coffee to the table. "Turned out my fence was exactly where it should be. Turned out Briggs knew that." She looked at him. "Thornton's foreman was lying about your boundary line." "Yes." 3 years ago." "Yes." "And this is the same man who's now telling people in town that I'm not fit to teach." Wyatt sat down. "Yes." She set the surveying text down carefully. "What does Thornton know about what his foreman does?" "Some of it," Wyatt said. "He's not a stupid man. He knows Briggs is aggressive. I think he finds it useful and doesn't ask too many questions about the method." She sat down across from him. "That's worse than if he just told Briggs to do it." "Probably," Wyatt agreed, "because it means he can always say he didn't know." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. Outside, the afternoon light was going, the short days of January collapsing quickly toward dark. Through the window, she could see the pasture and the distant line where the creek ran, and beyond it, the hills going pale and gray. "I need to find out how much damage Briggs has done," she said. "I've been asking around," Wyatt said, quietly. She looked at him. "How quietly?" "Quietly enough that he doesn't know I'm asking." He paused. "There are 4 families on the northern edge of the settlement who've been hearing his version of things. 2 of them, I think, are movable. The other 2 have reasons to stay close to Thornton regardless." "What kind of reasons?" "Thornton holds the water rights on the creek that runs through their land," Wyatt said. "He's been generous with the access, but it's access at his discretion. Makes people careful." She absorbed this. The practical man's practical leverage, operating at the level of water and land, the most fundamental things, keeping people oriented toward him through need rather than loyalty. "That's how he controls things," she said. "Part of how," Wyatt said. "He's not purely cynical about it. He's genuinely helped people out here. But the help comes with a shape to it." He looked at his coffee. "A man who holds your water has a certain kind of authority, regardless of whether he's ever specifically mentioned it." She thought about this for a long time. Then she said, "I need to go see those 4 families." Wyatt looked at her. "Not about Briggs," she said. "Not about myself. Just go see them. Introduce myself. Find out if their children need schooling. Find out if there's anything they need that I might be able to help with." She paused. "If Briggs has been talking, the best answer to talking is presence. Real, specific presence." "That's going to take time," Wyatt said. "I have time," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her for a moment with that quiet, direct attention that she had by now learned to simply receive without deflecting. "I can take you out on Saturdays," he said. "I know those routes, and my showing up with you will matter to some of them." She knew that was true. Wyatt Mercer's name carried weight in the outlying settlements. Not the weight of Thornton's resources, but the different and in some ways more portable weight of a man who was known to deal honestly and was careful about whose company he kept. "All right," she said. "Saturday." She rode back to Millhaven in the early dark, Wyatt riding alongside her to the edge of town before turning north, and she thought the whole way back about water rights and bookshelf surveys, and a man who'd learned to read the land because someone had lied to him about it. She was also thinking, in the quieter part of her mind, about the way the firelight had looked on his face while she wrung out her stockings, and the particular quality of being in a room with someone who does not require you to explain yourself, and how strange it was that these things existed in the same world as letters left at train stations and foremen who laughed on country roads. She didn't do anything with these thoughts. She just let them be there. The trouble that had been building across January broke into the open on the first Saturday of February. They had just come back from the second of the outlying farm visits, the Harmon family, 4 miles east, with 3 children who hadn't been coming to school because the distance was too far in winter, which Evelyn was already working on a solution to. When they found Asa Briggs standing in the middle of Millhaven's main street talking to a group of men outside the saloon. Briggs saw them coming. Evelyn could see him see them. The slight adjustment of his posture, the way the conversation changed quality. 2 of the men he was talking to turned to look. She rode past without stopping. Wyatt did the same, a half length behind her, which she took as a deliberate positioning choice on his part. "Don't look back," Wyatt said quietly, alongside her. "I'm not," she said. They left the horses at the livery at the end of the street and were walking back when Briggs caught up with them. He didn't run. He walked with deliberate purpose, and he positioned himself so that Evelyn had to either stop or go around him. She stopped. "Miss Hartwell," he said. He had the kind of face that arranged itself into pleasantness without actually becoming pleasant. "I hear you've been making visits to the Harmon farm and the Presley place last week." "I have," she said. "And Mercer's been your escort." He glanced at Wyatt with the particular look of a man making a point through the direction of his attention rather than his words. "Mr. Mercer knows those roads," Evelyn said. "Since I'm still learning the territory, it made sense to go with someone who does." "Of course." Briggs's pleasantness remained exactly as pleasant as it had been. "I imagine it also helps, having a man's company when you're visiting families who might otherwise be uncertain about welcoming a woman in your situation." The word situation landed the way he intended it to, loaded with the weight of everything he'd been telling people, the accumulated version of Evelyn Hartwell that he'd been constructing in conversations around town for 2 months. She looked at him steadily. "My situation," she said, "is that I'm the school teacher in this community. I'm visiting families whose children might benefit from coming to school. If you know of any families with children I haven't reached yet, I'd be grateful for the introduction." The pleasantness on his face didn't falter, but something behind it did, slightly. He hadn't expected the direct step into his framing. "Mr. Thornton speaks highly of your dedication," he said, shifting. "Tell him I appreciate that," she said. Briggs looked at her for a moment longer, then at Wyatt. The look between the 2 men was brief and contained a great deal of history that Evelyn could feel without being able to fully read. "Good afternoon, Miss Hartwell," Briggs said, and walked back toward the saloon. Evelyn watched him go. Then she turned and kept walking. Wyatt fell into step beside her. "You handled that well," he said, after half a block. "I didn't handle anything," she said. "I just answered what he actually said instead of what he meant." "That's handling it well." She was quiet for a moment. "He's going to escalate," she said. "Yes." "What does escalating look like for someone like Briggs?" Wyatt was quiet for a few steps. "He'll find something concrete," he said. "Something he can point to that sounds like a fact instead of an opinion, a practical complaint, something about the school, or about you specifically, that he can bring to the community as a concern rather than a campaign. And Thornton will let him." "And Thornton will let him." She thought about this. They had reached Mrs. Plunkett's, and she stopped at the steps. "Is there anything in my situation that he could point to, legitimately?" Wyatt considered the question honestly. "Your salary comes from community agreement," he said. "Technically, it requires reapproval each season. If he can persuade enough people to vote against renewal in the spring, the position disappears without anyone having to accuse you of anything specific." She absorbed this. Spring was 3 months away. "3 months?" she said. "Yes." "Then I have 3 months to become someone that 3 months of Briggs's work can't outweigh," she said. Wyatt looked at her. "You're already that," he said. "Maybe," she said. But I need the right people to know it clearly enough that doubt doesn't find a foothold. She went inside. She sat at her small desk upstairs with her notebook and thought about what she knew and what she needed, and she wrote lists and drew lines connecting things. And at the end of an hour, she had the shape of a plan that was not dramatic and was not confrontational and was simply the most direct possible thing, be so genuinely, specifically, concretely useful to this community that removing her became an idea too costly to entertain. She was going to need help. Wyatt would give it without being asked. Mrs. Plunkett had already given more than Evelyn had ever formally acknowledged. There were mothers in this community who valued what she was doing and hadn't been asked to say so in any organized way. It was not a perfect plan. It was a plan assembled from available materials, which was, she was increasingly understanding, what frontier life consisted of. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote, February 5th, 1885. Then she wrote, "Here is what I have." And she began, the plan. Evelyn had written in her notebook on the 5th of February was not elegant. It had no single dramatic move, no confrontation that would resolve everything in one clean stroke. It was a list of small, specific, repeatable actions, and it required patience of the kind that did not come naturally to a person who had spent most of her life fighting against time. She started with the mothers, not in any organized or formal way. She didn't call a meeting or send notices. She simply began, after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, making herself available at the schoolhouse for an extra hour. Not for the children, for anyone who wanted to come in. She kept the stove going, and she had tea when she could afford it, and coffee when she couldn't, and she sat at her desk with her notebook and did her lesson planning, and she left the door unlocked. The first Tuesday, nobody came. The second Tuesday, Margaret Garner appeared with her youngest on her hip and sat down in one of the adult chairs and talked for 40 minutes about a letter she needed help writing to her sister in Ohio. Evelyn helped her write it. The letter took 3 drafts because Margaret Garner had things she wanted to say that were complicated to organize, and Evelyn did not rush her through them or simplify them into something easier. When Margaret left, she said, "Same time next week?" "Same time next week," Evelyn said. By the 4th Tuesday, there were 6 women in the schoolhouse after hours, and they were not all there about letters. One needed help calculating whether her household budget could absorb the cost of a new iron stove. One wanted to understand the land survey document her husband had signed without fully reading, and one simply sat with her coffee and didn't say much but kept coming back, which Evelyn understood as its own kind of need and did not press. She did not call it a women's group or give it any name that would make it easy for Briggs or anyone else to characterize. It was just the schoolhouse, on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, with the door open. Word spread the way things spread in small communities, not through announcement, but through the particular reliable channel of one woman telling another woman something useful. The storm that changed everything arrived on the 14th of February. Evelyn knew the date not because of any sentiment attached to it, but because she'd been counting weeks toward the spring community meeting when her position would come up for review. And 6 weeks and 3 days out was where she was when the sky turned the particular yellow-gray that she'd learned, over 3 months, to recognize as serious weather coming. She dismissed school early. The children scattered home, and she banked the schoolhouse stove and shuttered the windows and walked back to Mrs. Plunkett's through a wind that had already shifted from cold to something more purposeful, the kind of wind that meant business and knew where it was going. By mid-afternoon, the storm was fully committed. It was not the largest storm Wyoming territory was capable of producing. It was, however, a storm that arrived fast and hit everything at once. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in under 2 hours. The snow came horizontal, and by 4 o'clock visibility on the main street was down to 20 feet. Evelyn was at Mrs. Plunkett's window watching this when the boy arrived. He was one of the Presley children, the eldest, Thomas, 13 years old, who had started coming to school 6 weeks ago after Evelyn's first Saturday visit to their farm. He arrived at Mrs. Plunkett's door so covered in snow and so short of breath that for a moment she couldn't understand what he was saying. Mrs. Plunkett got him inside and got his coat off and got something warm into his hands. And then he said it clearly. The Harmon barn caught fire from a lightning strike and the wind took it to the house. And they got the family out, but the Hendricks family was visiting and Mr. Hendricks got his leg broke trying to get the horses out. And there's people scattered between the Harmon place and the Presley place, and nobody knows where 2 of the Harmon children are. Mrs. Plunkett looked at Evelyn. Evelyn was already at the coat hooks. "Thomas," she said, pulling on her coat. How many people total? He counted in his head. The Harmon family, 6. Hendricks family, 4, plus Mr. Hendricks is hurt. There's a ranch hand who was at the Harmon place. Maybe 12 people. Where are they right now? Scattered between the 2 buildings. Mrs. Harmon got 4 of them into the root cellar, but the 2 youngest Harmon children... He stopped. His jaw worked. How old? 7 and 4. She pulled on her second boot. Which direction did they run? East, toward the creek. The creek. Wyatt's Creek. 4 miles north of town, and the Harmon place was 2 miles east of that, which meant those children, if they'd run toward the creek, were in a stretch of land she had ridden across 6 times in the past month and a half, and knew better than she'd have known any land in Pennsylvania. Mrs. Plunkett, she said, I need you to go to the saloon and the hardware store and get every man who's available and send them to the Harmon place by the North Road. Tell them there are injured people and missing children, and they need rope and blankets and a stretcher if they can make one. And you? Mrs. Plunkett said. I know where those children went, Evelyn said. She was out the door before Mrs. Plunkett could argue, which she likely would have, because Mrs. Plunkett was a practical woman who understood Wyoming storms, and understood that a woman with a chest condition going out into one was an argument worth making. Evelyn understood that too. She went anyway. The wind was a physical thing, not a presence she moved through so much as a force she was constantly negotiating with, step by step, leaning into it at angles, covering her face with her scarf when it drove ice crystals directly at her eyes. She knew the North Road well enough to stay on it even without being able to see more than a few feet ahead, keeping the wind at her right shoulder because that was east. And east was the direction of the creek, and the direction those children had run. She had not told Thomas to get Wyatt because she hadn't known where Wyatt was, and sending the boy back out into the storm to find him wasted time she didn't have. She was thinking about this as she walked, along with everything else she was thinking about, which was organized in her mind with the same systematic quality she applied to everything, what she knew, what she needed, what the order of operations was. What she knew, 2 children, 7 and 4. Running east from a fire, terrified in the early stages of what was now a serious storm. A 4-year-old could not run far. They had stopped somewhere. The question was where. She had ridden this stretch of land between the Harmon place and the creek on 3 separate Saturdays. She knew there was a rock formation about a mile east of the Harmon farm, not large, but enough to provide shelter from the wind on its western face. She knew there was also a dry wash that ran north to south about half a mile before the creek, and that a frightened child running east would eventually hit the wash and, if they had any instinct for shelter, might follow it north or south looking for a low place out of the wind. She was betting on the rock formation first. It was closer. She almost missed it entirely in the snow. Walked within 10 feet of it before the dark mass of it registered through the white, and she came around the western face of it calling out, not loudly because her lungs wouldn't support loudly in this cold, but steadily. And she heard something that might have been a sound, or might have been the wind, and she called again. It was a sound. They were wedged into the deepest angle of the rock, the older child. A girl, Nora, she remembered from Mrs. Harmon's descriptions, with her arms around the younger one, a boy named Samuel, who was not moving in a way that frightened Evelyn until she got close enough to see he was simply profoundly asleep, in the way small children sometimes went deeply unconscious under stress. Nora looked up at her with an expression that was past fear and had arrived at something very still and very old for a 7-year-old face. Can you walk? Evelyn said. Yes, Nora said. Samuel? He was scared and then he went to sleep, Nora said. I couldn't wake him. He's all right, Evelyn said, and she believed this. His color was acceptable, his breathing visible. Exhaustion and cold, but not the dangerous cold yet. He's going to be fine. I need you to hold my hand and stay very close to me, and I'm going to carry him. Can you do that? Nora looked at her with those old eyes. You're the school teacher, she said. I am. Papa said you came from the east. I did. Do you know the way back? Evelyn looked at the rock face above them, orienting herself to the wind direction, to the angle of the slope under the snow, to the 3 Saturday mornings of riding this terrain that were now filed in her mind as something more useful than scenery. Yes, she said. I know the way back. She picked up Samuel, who was heavier than he looked, and completely limp in the deadweight way of deeply sleeping children, and she took Nora's hand and she started back west. She heard Wyatt before she saw him, his voice calling out to the west of her, slightly south, and she called back and adjusted her direction, and they came together in the white about 10 minutes later. He had 2 other men with him, ranch hands she recognized from around town, and one of them took Samuel from her arms with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to carrying things, and the group moved together back toward the Harmon property. Wyatt fell in beside her. He looked at her face, and then at Samuel in the other man's arms, and then back at her. He didn't say anything for a moment, then, "Rock formation?" "East face," she said. He nodded, as though this confirmed something he'd already calculated. "I figured that's where you went when Mrs. Plunkett told me you'd gone out." "How long ago?" 20 minutes. I came fast." She felt the cold in her chest then, not her condition, just the cold itself, the deep settling of it after an hour of exertion in temperatures that had continued dropping. She breathed through it, in through the nose, 4 counts, steady. "The Hendricks family?" she said. "Gathered. The ranch hand got them all to the Presley place. Hendricks's leg is bad. Looks like a break below the knee. There's no doctor closer than Laramie." She processed this. "I can splint it and pack it properly. I've done it before." At his look, she added, "My father's medical books. And 3 younger brothers." He kept moving. "Then we go to the Presley place after this." It took another 40 minutes to get everyone from the rock formation back to the Harmon root cellar, where Mrs. Harmon had somehow managed to get a small lamp burning and had organized the children in a huddle with a horse blanket over them, and the sight of Nora and the sleeping Samuel coming through the cellar door made Mrs. Harmon make a sound that Evelyn felt in the base of her throat and had to look away from. She splinted Hendricks's leg on the floor of the Presley house 2 hours later, using 2 straight fence boards and strips torn from a flour sack, while his wife held his hand and the 2 men held him still, and he made sounds through his teeth that he was clearly trying to suppress and not entirely managing. She worked quickly and precisely, her father's voice in her memory explaining the mechanics of it, the pressure distribution, the importance of the ankle's position, the padding at the pressure points. When she finished, Hendricks looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has just been through something and is still processing it. "You done this before?" he said. "Not exactly this," she said, "but close enough." He looked at his leg, then at her. "You're the school teacher." "Yes." "Briggs said you were—" He stopped. "I know what Briggs said," she said without bitterness, just factually. She packed the last of the padding into place. "How does that feel?" "Better than it did," he said. She washed her hands in the basin his wife brought and dried them on a clean cloth and went to find Wyatt. They rode back to Millhaven in the tail end of the storm, which had begun to ease by 9 o'clock, the wind dropping to something merely cold rather than actively hostile. The main group of men had gone ahead with the Hendricks family in a wagon, making the best time they could on the drifted road. Evelyn and Wyatt came behind, not rushing. She was very tired. Not the dangerous kind of tired, just the thorough kind that came after several hours of sustained effort in difficult conditions. Her chest was tight, but manageable. She kept her breathing deliberate. Wyatt rode close enough that their horses were almost touching, which she understood was partly for navigation in the remaining poor visibility and partly something else that neither of them had named. "You found them," he said. "I knew where to look." A lot of people who knew where to look wouldn't have gone out in that storm. She was quiet for a moment. "I couldn't not go," she said. "That's different from brave." "Is it?" She thought about it honestly. "I think brave implies a choice where the alternative was genuinely viable," she said. "Leaving 2 children in a blizzard wasn't a viable alternative for me. So I'm not sure it was brave. I'm not sure I had a choice." "You always have a choice," he said. "You went out in it too." "Yes." "Was that brave?" He was quiet for a few steps. "No," he said. "Same thing. Not a viable alternative." She looked at him through the dark and the settling snow. There were things accumulating between them that neither of them had said, had been accumulating since November, since the platform at Millhaven Station, and the coat offered in the wind and a string of conversations in schoolhouses and kitchens and on frozen creek banks. She was aware of all of it with a clarity that the events of the evening had somehow sharpened, the way certain things became very precise when you'd been through something difficult and come out the other side. She didn't say any of it, not yet. The road was still uncertain underfoot and she was tired, and there were other things that needed to happen first. But she knew what was there. The shift in Millhaven happened over the next 2 weeks with a speed that surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Small communities have a particular mechanism for this kind of thing. A person exists in a town as a collection of rumors and impressions and secondhand accounts until a single concrete moment cuts through all of it and replaces the accumulated uncertainty with something direct and witnessed. Evelyn had found the Harmon children in a blizzard and splinted a broken leg on a farmhouse floor, and these were not stories filtered through Asa Briggs or anyone else. They were things that had happened in front of people who then told other people, and the account grew in the telling, not because anyone embellished it, but because the straightforward version was already more than the story Briggs had been constructing. Robert Hendricks, once his leg had been set by a doctor who arrived from a neighboring settlement 3 days later and confirmed the splint was correctly placed, was particular about telling people this. He told it in the saloon and in the hardware store, and to anyone who came to check on him at home, with the specific emphasis of a man who has been confronted with a gap between what he'd been told and what turned out to be true, and is correcting the record publicly and deliberately. Evelyn heard this from Mrs. Plunkett, who reported it without visible satisfaction, but with the particular precise detail of someone who has been waiting for an opportunity to report it. Clara Reeves came back to school on the Monday following the storm. She came alone, without any indication from her father and without explanation, and she sat down in her chair and put her brown paper square on the desk and looked at Evelyn as if to say that whatever was going to be said about her presence here could wait until she was less occupied with the spelling lesson. Evelyn said nothing about it. She simply welcomed Clara back and moved on, because that was what Clara needed. Not a discussion of what it had taken for her to get there, but simply the normalcy of being there as though she'd never been away. After school that day, Evelyn stayed late, and Jonas Reeves came in. He stood in the doorway the way he had the first time, hat in his hands, but with a different quality to his presence, less like a man claiming authority, more like a man navigating terrain he wasn't sure about. "My girl came back," he said. "She did," Evelyn said. He was quiet for a moment. "I heard what happened with the Harmon children." She waited. "My eldest boy was out there," he said, "in the search party that went from the Presley place." He looked at his hat. "He came home and told me about it." A pause. "About what the Harmon girls said. About what you did." "I was in the right place," Evelyn said. "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "I told Clara she wasn't welcome here because I didn't see the use of it, because I've got a farm and she's got work to do on it, and learning to read better wasn't going to change what her life was going to require." He looked up at her. "I'm not sure I was thinking about it right." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Reeves, Clara is one of the most capable students I've had. She has a mind that catches things quickly and holds them. What she does with that is her own concern and yours, and I'm not going to tell you how to run your family." She paused. "But I would consider it a loss to this community if she stopped coming." He looked at her. She could see him working something out, not an argument, but a recalibration, the same kind of slow mechanical adjustment she'd watched other people make when reality presented them with information their existing framework wasn't built for. "She can come," he said, 3 days a week. She's got chores the other days." 3 days a week is fine," Evelyn said. He put his hat back on and turned to go, and then stopped. "That thing Briggs has been saying about you," he said, "about you being unfit." She waited. "I don't hold with it," he said. It was not quite an apology. It was a man saying plainly where he stood, which in certain contexts was worth more than an apology. "Thank you," she said. He left. Asa Briggs came to the schoolhouse for the first and only time on a Thursday morning in late February, 3 weeks before the community meeting. He came when the children were there, which she thought was deliberate. He stood in the doorway in his good coat. Thornton's foreman money, she'd come to understand, was considerably better than ordinary ranch hand wages, and asked if he could speak with her outside. She told the older children to continue their reading and went to the doorway but did not step outside. She stood in the doorframe with the warm air of the schoolhouse at her back and the cold air of February in front of her. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I want to be straightforward with you." "I'd appreciate that," she said. "The community meeting in March will take up your position here," he said. "There will be voices that question whether to continue your salary." "I'm aware of that." He looked at her with a candor that she found, oddly, more uncomfortable than his pleasantness. It meant he'd decided the indirect approach was no longer efficient. "You've done well here," he said. "Better than I expected. That's—" a pause. "That's honest." "Thank you." "But Mr. Thornton has an interest in how this community is organized," he said. "The school, the positions in it, the people who hold them. These things matter to how the settlement grows. And Mr. Thornton has views about what kind of growth serves this community well." She looked at him. "And what kind is that?" "Stable," Briggs said. "Predictable. Organized around the people and resources that have been here longest." She understood perfectly what he was saying. It was not actually a threat. It was a description of power, the water rights and the land and the 10 years of Thornton's operation shaping this community in the particular way that long-established resources always shaped communities, by making themselves indispensable and then defining what indispensable meant. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "I'm going to continue doing what I do. In March, the community will decide. I trust them to decide based on what they've seen." She paused. "I also trust that you'll report this conversation to Mr. Thornton accurately." Something shifted in his expression. "You know I will." "I know," she said. "I'm counting on it." She went back inside. She told Wyatt that evening. They were at his kitchen table. They had ended up there often enough now that it no longer required explanation or occasion. And she told him the substance of the conversation and watched his face as she did. "You told him you were counting on him to report it," Wyatt said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I want Thornton to hear exactly what I said," she said. "I want him to know that I'm not afraid of the meeting. I want him to hear that I trust the community." She looked at her coffee. "And partly because I want him to have to decide what kind of man he's going to be when there's no convenient ambiguity left." Wyatt was quiet. "He's been letting Briggs do things he didn't order and didn't stop," she said. "That's a position a man can hold for a while, but eventually the situation makes it uncomfortable to keep holding. I want to make it uncomfortable." "That's a risk," Wyatt said. "Everything out here is a risk," she said. "I moved to Wyoming in November. I understand risk." He looked at her for a moment with that steady attention that she had long since stopped trying to deflect. "The meeting's in 3 weeks," he said. "I know." "I'll be there." "I know that too," she said. And then, because something in the plainness of his statement made plainness feel like the right response, "Wyatt, I want to say something and I need you to let me say all of it before you respond." He waited. "When I got off that train in November," she said, "I had a plan for my life, a specific, organized plan. A house, a husband, a settled situation, all the things I'd spent 18 months arranging. That plan ended in 30 seconds with a sealed letter." She looked at her hands. "What I have instead is a school teacher's salary, a room at Mrs. Plunkett's, 23 children, and a few additional ones I'm still working on, a north wall with a bracket I didn't install myself, and a position that might or might not survive a community vote in March." She paused. "I don't have a plan anymore. I have a life. And they're not the same thing, and I've spent a long time thinking they were the same thing." She looked up at him. "I'm not telling you this because I want something specific from you tonight," she said. "I'm telling you because you've been part of how I figured it out, and I think you should know that." The kitchen was very quiet. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that was reading something with care, the way he read a survey document or a creek bank, not rushing it. "Evelyn," he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name without her prompting it. "Yes." "The plan you had," he said. "The house, and the husband, and the settled situation." "Yes." "Did any of it look like this?" She looked around his kitchen, the honest, functional room with the bookshelf on the east wall, and the coffee on the stove, and the window that faced north toward the pasture where the creek ran straighter now because they'd moved a rock together in January. "No," she said. "Is that a problem?" She thought about it the way the question deserved. Not quickly, not with the answer she'd already half-formed, but with genuine attention. "No," she said. It's not. He nodded, slowly, in the way he did when something had been confirmed rather than concluded, when the answer matched what he'd suspected, but he'd needed to hear it from the source. Then let's get through March 1st, he said, and then we'll see what we're working with. It was not a declaration. It was not a sweeping, romantic statement. It was a man who'd been wrong before being careful about the order of operations, and she understood that completely because she was the same way, and she found she was more comfortable with his careful approach than she would have been with anything more immediate. Yes, she said, March 1st. She finished her coffee and pulled on her coat to go, and at the door she stopped. The Melville, she said, the second time you read it. What was the part that made more sense? He thought about it. The whale, he said. The first time I thought it was about obsession. The second time I thought it was about what happens when a man decides something outside himself is responsible for everything that's gone wrong inside him. She looked at him. Different book, second time, he said. She went out into the cold February night and rode back to Millhaven with that thought sitting alongside everything else. And the stars were out now that the storm had fully passed. The sky, the kind of clear that only happened after weather had scoured everything clean, and the land around her was white and still and enormous in every direction. And she was, she realized, not afraid of any of it. She had stopped being afraid of it somewhere between November and now, and she hadn't noticed the exact moment it happened, which was probably the way it always happened with the things that actually changed you. Not in a single dramatic instant, but in the accumulation of small mornings, each one slightly less terrifying than the one before, until one day you looked up and found you were simply someone who lived here. She rode into Millhaven and put her horse at the livery and walked back to Mrs. Plunkett's in the cold and the clear, and she went to bed and slept without dreaming, which was the best sleep she'd had since Philadelphia. The community meeting was held on the 7th of March, in the schoolhouse, because there was nowhere else in Millhaven large enough to hold the number of people who showed up. Evelyn had not expected the number. She had prepared for perhaps 30 people, the families whose children she taught, a handful of others from the outlying farms, the usual contingent of men who attended any public meeting on principle. What arrived, starting at 6:30 and still coming in as the 7 o'clock start time passed, was closer to 60. People she recognized and people she didn't. Families from the northern settlements she'd visited on Saturdays. The Hendricks family, Robert Hendricks on a crutch that someone had made him from a good straight piece of ash. Jonas Reeves, standing near the back with his eldest boy. Mrs. Plunkett, who had positioned herself near the front with the specific deliberateness of a woman who intended to be seen and heard if the occasion required it. Caleb Thornton was there. He stood on the right side of the room with two of his ranch hands and Asa Briggs, and he had the look of a man who had also not expected the number. Evelyn stood at the front near her desk and watched people file in and felt something she recognized after a moment as the particular uncomfortable mixture of gratitude and vulnerability that came from realizing how much other people had been paying attention when you weren't watching. The meeting was chaired by Harold Fitch, the owner of the hardware store, who served as the closest thing Millhaven had to a municipal authority. I was a compact, fair-minded man who ran meetings with the brisk efficiency of someone who preferred resolution to process, and he opened by stating the matter plainly. The community's school teacher position required seasonal renewal, and they were here to discuss whether to renew Miss Hartwell's appointment for the coming year. He asked if anyone wanted to speak. Asa Briggs spoke first. He was good at it. She had to give him that. He didn't attack her directly. A man who attacked a woman directly in front of 60 frontier families was going to lose the room before he finished his first sentence, and Briggs was too experienced for that. He spoke about the community's need for stability, about the importance of the school teacher position being filled by someone with roots in the territory, someone whose long-term commitment was certain. He spoke about the challenges of the frontier climate and what it demanded physically of everyone who lived here. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. When he finished, Harold Fitch asked if anyone else wanted to speak. Margaret Garner stood up. She was not a natural public speaker. Her voice was too quiet at first, and she had to be encouraged by someone nearby to speak up. But what she said was specific and plain and entirely unembellished. She talked about the letter she'd needed help writing to her sister in Ohio, and how Evelyn had spent 2 hours with her on a Tuesday afternoon going through 3 drafts, and how her sister had written back and said it was the clearest letter she'd ever received from Margaret in 30 years of correspondence. She said she didn't know what roots in the territory meant exactly, but she knew what it meant to have someone help you say what you needed to say, and that seemed like a root of a different kind. She sat down. Robert Hendricks spoke next, still on his crutch, and he did not speak about the splint, which surprised her. He spoke about the Harmon children, specifically about what Nora Harmon had told him when she was warmed up and safe and being asked about what had happened. He said that Nora had told him that the school teacher had come out of the storm and found them at the rock and had picked up her brother and had said, without any hesitation, that she knew the way back. He said that there was a particular quality to that kind of certainty in a crisis, the kind that didn't come from bravado but from actually knowing something, and that in his experience, the people who had that quality were the people you wanted in your community regardless of where they'd come from. Then the Harmon family spoke, and one of the Presley men and two of the mothers from the Tuesday and Thursday afternoon sessions, and a man Evelyn barely knew from the far northern settlement who said simply that his daughter had learned to read in this school, and that was enough for him. Through all of it, Evelyn stood at the front of the room and kept her hands still and her face composed, which required more effort than anything she had done in Wyoming, including moving the rock. Then Caleb Thornton stood up. The room shifted, the particular atmospheric shift of a large group of people all redirecting their attention at once. He stood with his hat in his hands, which was something, and he looked at Evelyn for just a moment before he addressed the room. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to be direct about it." Harold Fitch nodded. "When Miss Hartwell arrived in Millhaven last November, I sent her a letter," Thornton said. "Most people in this room know about that letter. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He paused. "I told her she wasn't what I needed, that she was a burden my operation couldn't support." He turned his hat in his hands. "I was wrong about that. Not just wrong about her specifically, though I was wrong about her. I was wrong about the way I was thinking. I looked at what I thought was a limitation, and I made a decision about a whole person based on it, and that's—" He stopped. "That's not a way of seeing people that I'm proud of." The room was very quiet. "I can't speak to what my foreman has been saying around town," he said, and Evelyn noticed the careful, constructed distance of what my foreman has been saying. Not a lie, but not the full truth either. The practical man still navigating the gap between accountability and exposure. "But I can speak to what I've seen myself. Miss Hartwell has built something here. She's done it in 4 months, in conditions that would have sent most people back east, and she's done it well." He looked at her directly. "I'd like to see her stay." He sat down. The vote, when Harold Fitch called it, was not close. Afterward, people lingered the way they did when a meeting had gone one way rather than another, and the relief of it made everyone slightly more inclined toward company. Evelyn stood near the door thanking people as they filed out, and the gratitude she felt was real and specific and a little overwhelming, and she dealt with it by focusing very intently on each individual face and name and saying something genuine to each one rather than a repeated formulation. Clara Reeves was near the end of the line with her father. Jonas Reeves stopped in front of Evelyn with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is now executing it, which was different from the expression of a man who was comfortable with the decision but was doing it anyway. "She'll be here 5 days a week," he said, "starting Monday." Evelyn looked at Clara, who was looking at the floor with the elaborate studied neutrality of a child who has learned not to show hope before it's confirmed. 5 days a week, Evelyn said. "Good." Clara looked up, those sharp, watchful eyes. "Monday?" Evelyn said to her. 7:30. Clara nodded once, precisely, and went out with her father. Asa Briggs left without speaking to her, which was the best possible outcome from Briggs, and she noted it and let it go. The last person in the room, after Harold Fitch had locked up his papers and the remaining families had gone home through the cold March night, was Wyatt. He had been in the back of the room for the entire meeting, which she had been aware of in the specific way she had become aware of where he was in any room they were both in. Not obsessively, just as a kind of orientation, the way you're aware of North when you've learned to navigate by it. I was standing by the window when she finished straightening the chairs, and the lamp on her desk was the last one still lit, and the room had the particular quality of a place that has held a lot of people and then emptied. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She sat down in one of the adult chairs and let her shoulders drop for the first time since 7 o'clock. The relief of it was almost physical, not the meeting's outcome, though that too, but the simple mechanical relief of no longer holding herself at attention. "Thornton," she said. "I didn't expect that." "I did," Wyatt said. She looked at him. "He's not a bad man," Wyatt said. "We've been over that. He's a man who calculates, and somewhere between November and tonight, the calculation changed." He came and sat in the chair across from her, the two of them in the circle of lamplight with the empty room around them. "Doesn't erase the letter, but it's something." "It is something," she agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "What did you make of what he said about Briggs?" "What my foreman has been saying," Wyatt quoted, with a slight flat precision that communicated exactly what he made of it. "He's not going to acknowledge it fully," she said. "No, but he'll rein Briggs in. That's what matters practically." She nodded. It was enough. It was the practical outcome, and she had learned in 4 months of Wyoming to value practical outcomes without requiring them to be accompanied by the full moral accounting she would have preferred in a more perfect world. "You said March 1st, she said. "Then we'd see what we were working with." "I did say that." She looked at him. "It's the 7th. "Close enough," he said. She felt the laugh come before she could decide whether to let it, and she let it. A short, real sound in the empty schoolroom, and he smiled at it, which was one of the better things she'd seen in recent memory. "I want to say something," she said, "and I'm going to say it plainly because I found that plain works better with you than anything else." "It does," he agreed. "I came to Wyoming for a specific life," she said. "A planned life. A life where I knew what the next 10 years looked like. And I didn't get that life." She looked at her hands. "What I got instead is this. This town, these children, this completely unreasonable landscape that is trying to kill everyone in it on a rotating schedule." She looked up at him. "And you, who showed up at a train station in a storm and gave a stranger your coat and apparently decided that was worth following up on." He was very still, listening. "I'm not the woman who arrived in November," she said. "Or I am, but I'm also someone else now, someone I didn't know I was going to be. And I'm fairly certain, that the person I'm becoming is someone who belongs here." A pause. "With you, if that's the thing you want." He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, "The day you got off that train." "Yes." "Everyone on that platform had already made up their mind about you," he said. "The station master, the porter, the people passing through. They'd all decided what they were looking at." He leaned forward slightly, forearms on his knees. "I looked at you and I saw someone who just had something terrible happen, who was cold and exhausted and alone, and who was standing absolutely straight anyway." He paused. "I didn't know what that was going to turn into, but I knew it was worth paying attention to." She held his gaze. "That's a yes," he said. "I know it's a yes," she said. "I just wanted to hear the whole thing." He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat like that in the lamplight for a while without saying anything, which was the most natural thing she'd experienced in longer than she could clearly remember. Spring came to Millhaven. The way it always did in Wyoming, not gently, not as a clean transition from one season to the next, but as an argument between winter and something warmer, a back and forth that lasted weeks, alternating warm days that softened the mud, and cold nights that froze it again, the landscape rearranging itself by degrees. The school grew. By April, she had 28 students, and by May, the number was 31. The Tuesday and Thursday afternoon sessions continued and expanded. She had started a separate reading circle for 3 women who wanted to improve their own literacy, quietly and without fuss. And she ran it with the same matter-of-fact normalcy she brought to everything, because the most useful thing she could do for a woman learning to read at 40 was to not make it into more of an occasion than it needed to be. Clara Reeves turned out to be exactly what Evelyn had suspected from the beginning. The girl had a mind that moved fast and organized what it took in with an almost architectural precision, building understanding the way you built a sound structure. Foundation first, then walls, then the refinements that made it something you could live in. She was reading at a level 2 years above her age by June, and she had begun, tentatively, to help the younger children with their letters during the morning free period, which she did with a patience that surprised everyone except Evelyn. Evelyn told Wyatt about it one evening in April, sitting on the front step of his house in the first genuinely warm evening of the season, watching the last of the light go off the hills. "She's going to be a teacher," Evelyn said. Or something else, Wyatt said. But something. Something, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been thinking about the East Room. She looked at him. The East Room of his house was currently used for storage. Tools, spare rope, sacks of grain. Thinking about it how? She said. Thinking about whether it needs to still be storage, he said. She looked at the side of his face. He was watching the hills with his characteristic patient attention. Are you asking me something? She said. I'm thinking out loud, he said. Wyatt. He looked at her. Yes, he said. I'm asking you something. She looked at the hills. The light was almost gone now, the sky moving through the last of its colors toward dark, and somewhere in the pasture one of his cattle was making a sound of absolute bovine contentment that she found, improbably, one of the more calming sounds she'd encountered in Wyoming. I'm going to need a room for my books, she said. There's a shelf. I have more books than your shelf. I can build another shelf. She looked at him. You can build another shelf. I built the first one. She looked back at the hills and felt something settle in her chest, not the careful, deliberate settling of her breathing exercises, but the other kind, the involuntary kind, the kind that happened when something that had been held in suspension for a long time finally came to rest in the right place. Yes, she said. He nodded once, in the way he did when something was confirmed rather than concluded. They sat on the step until it was fully dark, and then went inside. She went to see Caleb Thornton in May. She hadn't planned it exactly, had been riding past the turn to his ranch on a Saturday afternoon when the thought arrived with the particular directness of something she'd been not thinking about for long enough that it had simply accumulated into a decision without her formal participation. He was in his yard when she rode up. He looked surprised, not alarmed, just surprised, the honest, unguarded expression of a man who hadn't expected this particular thing on this particular afternoon. She dismounted and they stood in his yard in the May sunshine, which was real and warm and nothing like the frozen light she'd arrived in, and she said, I wanted to say something to you and I didn't want to do it through other people. All right, he said. What you said at the meeting, she said. About the letter. About the way you were thinking. She looked at him directly. That took something. I want you to know I'm aware of that. He was quiet for a moment. It was the least I could do, he said. Maybe, she said, but people don't always do the least they could do. Some people don't do anything at all. She paused. I'm not going to tell you it didn't matter. It did. And I'm not going to tell you we could have been what we were supposed to be. She said this as carefully as she could because it was a real thing and not a cruel one, and she wanted him to receive it correctly. But I wanted to tell you that I don't think about you with bitterness. I think that's worth saying. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she didn't entirely have a word for, something between regret and a kind of recognition. The look of a man seeing clearly what he'd had and lost in a way that he genuinely couldn't have understood in the moment. Mercer's a good man, he said. I know, she said. He nodded. Then that's good, he said, without false lightness, just directly, as two adults standing in a yard in Wyoming acknowledging what was true. She mounted and rode back. She felt lighter on the return, not because the conversation had been easy, but because it had been honest. And honest conversations, even the difficult ones, left you lighter than the weight of the things left unsaid. She and Wyatt were married in June in the schoolhouse, which was the largest room in Millhaven and was, as Evelyn pointed out to Mrs. Plunkett, already hers in the ways that mattered. It was not a large ceremony. Evelyn did not want a large ceremony. She wanted the specific people, Mrs. Plunkett, who wore a hat that suggested she'd had it for 20 years and intended to get 20 more years out of it. The Garner family, the Hendricks couple, Robert still occasionally using his crutch on difficult terrain. Clara Reeves and her father, Jonas, who had arrived without being entirely sure he was welcome and had been immediately pulled into the group by his daughter, with a firmness that suggested she had decided this was where they were and that was the end of it. She wore her green dress, the one that had seen better days, because she had bought the material for a new one and then spent the money on additional reading primers for the school instead, a decision she made without particular conflict, and which Wyatt, when she told him, had simply nodded at in the way that meant he understood something fundamental about who she was. Harold Fitch presided. in his capacity as the closest thing Millhaven had to official authority, reading from a civil text with the brisk practicality he brought to everything. When it was done, Clara Reeves was the first person to come forward, with the directness that was entirely her own nature, and she said to Evelyn, "Are you still going to be the teacher?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "I'm still going to be the teacher." Clara considered this. "Good," she said, and stepped back. There was a night in August, 4 months into the life she was building in the east room of Wyatt's house, now cleared of grain sacks and furnished with the second bookshelf he'd built, which was better than the first one, when Evelyn sat at the desk by the window and wrote a letter to her mother in Philadelphia. She had written monthly since arriving in Wyoming. Her mother had written back with the same frequency, the letters arriving in clusters when the mail was delayed, and then all at once, a small avalanche of her mother's careful handwriting and the news of a life that felt, reading about it now, very far away and very dear. She thought about what to write. She had told her mother the major events: Wyatt, the school, the community vote, the marriage. Her mother had responded to each with a mixture of relief and something that read, between the lines, like a quiet and private acknowledgement that she had been wrong to worry as much as she had, which was the closest her mother would come to saying she had been wrong to worry. She wrote, "I want to tell you something I've been thinking about." She paused, looking at the hills through the window, dark now in the August evening, with the creek line visible only as an absence of stars at the horizon. She wrote, "I came here broken in a specific way. Not the way you worried about, not the cough, not the health. Broken in the way that a person gets broken when they spend a long time being defined by what they can't do rather than what they can. I didn't know I was broken that way until I got here and started being asked to do things anyway." She paused again. "I found out something that I don't think anyone had told me clearly, or if they had, I hadn't heard it. That the things I thought were limitations, the condition, the background, the arriving alone and without resources, those were just conditions. They were the weather, not the forecast. The forecast is something else entirely, and it's not written by your limitations. It's written by what you choose to do inside them." She looked at what she'd written. Then she wrote, "The woman who stood on that train platform in November and refused to leave. I understand her better now. She wasn't brave. She was just not done yet. There's a difference, I think. Brave suggests you know the outcome might be bad and you go anyway. Not done yet is something quieter. It's just, there is more, and I haven't found it yet, and therefore I am not leaving. I am still not done yet. I think that might be the best thing I know about myself." She folded the letter and set it aside to post in the morning. From the other room, she could hear the small sounds of the house settling, the particular language of wood and stone that she had learned over weeks of living inside it, the way every house had its own vocabulary of creaks and silences. Outside, the August night had cooled from the day's warmth, and the wind off the hills carried something almost sweet, the dry grass and the distant creek and the enormous clean dark of a sky that had no city in it anywhere. Wyatt appeared in the doorway. "You're still up," he said. "I was writing to my mother." He came in and looked at the desk and the lamp and the two bookshelves with their combined populations of his books and hers, now mixed together in the way that books get mixed when people stop thinking about whose shelf is whose. "Come outside," he said. "The stars are something tonight." She capped her pen and followed him out. They stood in the yard behind the house, and the stars were in fact something, the particular August brilliance of a sky at elevation, away from any significant light, so dense with stars that the dark between them seemed like the exception rather than the rule. She had looked at this sky before and found it overwhelming, the sheer scale of it, the way it made everything human feel very small and provisional. She didn't feel that tonight. She felt, and she considered this carefully, because she was a person who didn't trust easy feelings. She felt situated, located, like someone who had found the specific place in a very large landscape where she was supposed to be standing. Not permanent, not guaranteed. Nothing out here was permanent or guaranteed, and she had stopped needing it to be. The creek could shift. A hard winter could take the cattle. The school could change. The town could change. Everything could change. The frontier was not a settled place, and she was not a person who needed it to be. But tonight, in this yard, with this man beside her, and this sky above, and the specific reality of everything she had built in 8 months out of nothing but refusal and effort and the particular stubbornness of a person who was not done yet. Tonight, she was exactly where she was, and that was enough. Wyatt reached for her hand and she gave it to him. "The Eastfield's going to need work before the winter," he said. "I know." The Presley boy asked if he could help on Saturdays for some extra wages. "He's a good worker," she said. "Say yes." "Already did." She looked at the stars. There was something she'd understood slowly over the course of these 8 months about the nature of a life. She'd spent a long time thinking a life was something you arranged, selected from available options, negotiated into the best configuration, then maintained. A plan with contingencies. Something you could look at from a distance and see the whole shape of. What she understood now was that a life wasn't a shape you could see from outside. It was something you were inside, and from inside it was never the clean thing it looked like from a distance. It was the creek bank eroding on one side while it rebuilt on the other. It was 23 children becoming 31. It was a letter left at a train station that ended one thing, and in ending it, made room for something that couldn't have existed otherwise. It was a woman standing on a platform in the snow, alone and rejected, and not going anywhere, not because she was brave, but because she was not done yet, and the not done yet was the seed of everything that came after. She thought about all the women who had stood where she'd stood, not at that specific platform, but in that specific moment, the moment when the plan collapsed, and the question became whether there was anything left of you outside the plan. She thought about how many of them had turned around and gone back, and she did not judge them for it, because going back was also a kind of survival, and survival was not a small thing. She just knew now what the other road looked like, the one where you stayed. It looked like this. It looked like a schoolhouse on the east side of a frontier town, and a creek running straighter than it used to, and 31 children who knew things they hadn't known before, and a man who had never once looked at her and seen a limitation, only a person in process, and 2 bookshelves that had stopped being 2 bookshelves and were simply 1. "The north fence needs looking at too," Wyatt said, "before the cold." "One thing at a time," she said. "That's all there ever is," he said. She looked at the stars a while longer, her hand in his, the wind off the hills, the creek somewhere in the dark doing what it did, moving, always moving, cutting its way through whatever was in front of it, patient and persistent and entirely indifferent to anyone's opinion of whether it should. She had come a long way to learn something that could have been said in one sentence, but the sentence wouldn't have meant anything until she'd lived her way into it, mile by mile and month by month, from a train platform in November to an August night with the whole sky open above her. The sentence was this: who you are is not decided by who rejects you. It is decided slowly and imperfectly and without anyone else's permission by what you do next. That was all. That was the thing. She held on to it, and Wyatt's hand, and the night.